All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is Thursday once again, and a pretty nice Thursday, at least here in Pennsylvania. Today we are doing it again, Tuesdays and Thursdays every week. We've been pretty good about staying on point on there. A couple of housekeeping items while we're waiting for our guest to join us here today. It'll be a really interesting conversation, honestly, and I think one that's long overdue, probably, to be honest. But some housekeeping to get started while we're waiting. So everybody knows that we have the Channel Strong Tour that's coming up. You know, we finished in May, but got another one here coming up in June. Just gonna share my screen real quick. So here are our locations and dates. So if anyone is in the Northeast or willing to travel to the Northeast, that is now finally open. We would love to see you. This is all outdoors still, even if the masks aren't needed anymore. So July 19th to the 30th. Again, just in the afternoon, kind of towards the end of the day, come out, talk shop, grab a beer, grab a sandwich. Costs you absolutely nothing. You can go down here and request an invite. If you're an MSP, you'll get access to do that. Last thing I want to mention is our giveaways, right? So this month we have 10 vendors in the mix that are giving away some pretty cool prizes. Every month they remind people, if you don't register, you can't win. So it's kind of like a lottery ticket. Go and buy one. Costs you nothing here. And lastly, this session and every other session we've ever done since March of 2020 are all available online, and some pretty good content here. So a couple hundred sessions, I feel. So don't hesitate after this episode to come back, check this out. If you're wanting to go back and double check some of the stuff that we go over in this session or maybe other sessions, doesn't hurt. This content lives out there and you can fast forward, download, rewind. So we bring back Mr. Ryan Burton from PAX8. Ryan's been on the show before. And it's been, I don't know, probably about 4 months or so since we've had you on. How you doing, Ryan?
Good, George. How you doing? It's been a little bit, so thanks for bringing me back on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, we appreciate you for taking time out. You're a busy guy, and we understand that your time's super valuable. Yeah. So summertime now, we're being told maybe the best travel season for summer stuff in the last 20 years for obvious reasons. So it'll be interesting to see, if anybody gets any work done over the next couple of months. But I mean, listen, the bad guys don't stop, right? I mean, seems like every other week there's a problem that has affected everybody on a larger scale. And I mean, the Colonial Pipeline was probably the larger one of the most recent memory, but I just saw today that the SEC is finally starting to probe the SolarWinds thing from earlier in the year. So, let's be fair, it's not going away, right? And one of the big topics that has been happening for at least the last 16 months has been security. And it's confusing, Ryan. It really, really, really is confusing, because just like if I were to go to any hosting provider, any data center, and they say, oh, managed services, but that's not the same managed services that we consider managed services, but the marketing message is still the same. The copy is very similar. It's really super confusing as to what am I buying? And I think that now the security stack's so deep, right? It's not just antivirus and UTM and a malware scanner. It goes a lot further than that. I'm curious from your perspective, and listen, you have a lot of vendors you work with on a daily basis. PAX8 has a lot of people in their line card around security, but just generally the market in general, right? How do you decide if vendor A and vendor B are even offering the same thing?
Well, I mean, in this market today, I would say that the problem is around the marketing front, because you can't just look on a website or look at what they're presenting right away and determine what they're actually doing. Because like you mentioned before, they all sound very similar and they use the same buzzwords, right? So the way to essentially, do it justice is by actually digging in and asking a lot of questions, understanding their product. And, I spent several years now looking at all these additional layers of security that are entering the MSP space, especially on the managed security side. Is probably one of the biggest areas, right? Where MSPs today are starting to outsource a lot of their security work to MSSPs or vendors, right? Just because of the nature of our business in the MSP space is there's just not a lot of time and expertise around deep security knowledge, right? So there's a lot of these vendors that are coming out, and they have been for several years now, and a lot of the messaging is just very confusing. So I think that by doing a lot of this research and talking to a lot of vendors and understanding it, it's very clear once you start to realize the differences between the marketing messages. And I think earlier on, I would say a year and a half, 2 years ago, it was really bad from a marketing perspective. Now you're starting to see that vendors are honing in their message a little bit better so people can kind of distinguish between the two. But one of the big areas I would say right now is, you've got your SOC as a service vendors, your MDR vendors, your XDR vendors, your SIM vendors, and your SIM as a service. Well, what does it all mean, right? Tell me, and what's the difference between them all? And I know for myself, it took me a long time to kind of, I've always known what these products are, but it took me a long time to talk to the vendors to understand what service they're actually providing, right?
It sounds like in the earlier days, there was a software play, right? Hey, install our software. It's going to start pulling in data and aggregating it into at least one place. But then it kind of still left you in a lurch as a service provider to say, all right, I now have these alerts. It's like almost early day RMM, right? I have all these alerts. What do I do with them? Do I even know what to actually do once they pop in? And a lot of people, they don't even have the know-how internally to do something with it, right? They're kind of confused as to the messaging. I know some people, they deploy the agent that comes with their software package that they subscribe to. And then if there's a hit, they just go and reformat. They don't even have the time or the knowledge or the expertise to go and figure out what the compromise is. And they just start from scratch. It's a very rudimentary way to do it, but.
Yeah. So you're kind of bringing up a point where the first thing to come to the MSP market from the enterprise, and by the way, this has been in the enterprise for quite a while, but the first thing to come into the MSP space from the enterprise was a SIM type tool or a log management tool, right? And this was, security a few years ago was very focused on log management, log aggregation, and looking through the logs and sifting through the data to find IOCs, or indicators of compromise, right? And so SIM and SIM as a service were kind of the first vendors to come to the MSP space. I think one of the big vendors was Alien Vault, really kind of was one of the first vendors to get in there. And you're right, it was a lot of logs and a lot of alerts. And it wasn't you talk to an MSP and say, do you have time to go through 200 alerts a day? Of course not, right? There's no way. And so these partners would go and put these tools in, and they would literally stack up all these alerts they'd never get through, right? And so that was kind of the first entrance to these vendors. And so what you started to see is other vendors coming in and saying, I'll do a lot of the work for you as an MSSP that knows what they're doing and has spent time looking for IOCs and looking through log management tools. And they'll go through and parse it and reduce it to as little amount of potential false positives as possible to real-time alerts. Here's your I'd call it your potential threats, but here's your real threats you need to look at right away, right? And so there's other vendors out there that have come out to show, okay, here's the exact events that you really need to be paying attention to, and then let me alert you to it, right? And so there's those vendors, and that's more on the kind of the SIM as a service, I would call it. There's a lot of marketing term around SOC as a service there as well. And the problem, though, is that you still run into vendors in our space that aren't grabbing all log data. So there's some vendors out there that grab all logs and sift through all data, but then there's other vendors who say, I'm only looking at logs I think are security events. But the problem is then you're running into a compliance issue, because if you look at compliance actually needs to grab all data. Right. So, if you think it SIM and all that, it's very compliance driven, right? It is very much compliance driven. So Anyway, so going back to this, so it's kind of watery from a vendor marketing perspective on that side. Is if you're going to look for a SIM as a service and you need it for compliance, you should be looking at vendors who make sure, if you ask a vendor, are you capturing every log event, all logs, right? Very, very important. And that'll knock out probably almost all vendors in the, not all, it will knock out a good amount of the vendors in the MSP space. Okay.
Wow. That's that one question, huh?
From the SIM side, yeah. I mean, or from the SOC as a service side, yeah. There's a lot of vendors when you talk to them, you say, "Are you grabbing all logs?" And you'll take your list of maybe 5 or 6 vendors you're looking at, and you might get a couple now, right? So it'll definitely cut that pretty quickly down. The other thing, the other vendors out there, so that's the compliance-driven SIM SOC as a service space. So hopefully that clears it up. What that is I'm looking at all logs and I'm trying to funnel as much data in there as possible. So not only am I pulling data from my endpoints, but I'm pulling data from my firewalls, and I'm setting up essentially a syslog server to grab all those events, as many events as I can possibly gather. I'm going to feed the SIM, right? And then hopefully with the service, if it's a good service, that vendor or that MSSP type, SOC team will go through those alerts, reduce the noise, and then get you the right alerts, right? But by the way, it's mainly an alerting service, right? Mainly alerting service. So they're going to send you open a ticket or send you an email saying this is the alerts you need to deal with, right?
So what is there people are there? So the software is part one, the actual human element, right? Hey, I'm validating, right? And determining if there's legitimate things from the logs is the part two. That's actually the second part of the service. That's SOC as a service.
That's the SOC team going through and saying, I'm going to go through all this noise and look for indicators of compromise, real threats, and they'll kind of classify it, right? And a lot of the vendors will give you the ability to tweak what alerts you want based on risk profile, right? But essentially, they can generate alerts. But, to be honest with you, it does take expertise to know what they're looking for, because all of this stuff is stuff that gets past your security controls, right? So here's the real reason why you do need this stuff is because everything they're going to alert you on most of the time is stuff that got past all your security controls, right? So got past your firewall, got past your endpoint vendors, got past everything else, and they're looking for these indicators of compromise inside your network, right?
So somebody's offering a software only solution, but they're saying it's SOC. Is that really what they're marketing? It seems like there's a mismatch. There's still to me, when I think SOC, I think knock, right? A bunch of people monitoring stuff, checking stuff, actually kicking the tires to make sure that whatever that issue is actually a problem, right? But if they're offering a software only solution, how can they brand it or market it as SOC and it actually be that?
Well, they can market however they want. That's the problem. So I mean, I think, know what you're getting. So if you're getting a service where they're saying, I'm looking for these very specific events, and that's all the log data that I'm gathering these very specific things. Not saying that it doesn't disvalue the service anyway. I just want to make sure that you know what you're getting, right? That you're not getting it doesn't help with compliance, some compliance standards that require to gather all logs. So that's one of the big pieces you need to make sure is, are you gathering all the logs? Are you looking through all the data? Is that going to check compliance box? Yes or no? If they don't do that, it's not checking the compliance box. And then can I feed the data? Can I integrate some of my products that I already buy into your platform and have your SOC team go through and look at all these events and reduce the noise and not send me duplicate alerts? I don't want alerts that my endpoint vendor might have found. I want alerts that got past my endpoint vendor, right? And is that configurable or whatever, right? So that's just stuff to look for on the SIM. I'm going to call that the SIM side, right? And a lot of vendors will term it SIM or SOC as a service, but that's one of the main areas. Now let's kind of break away and talk about the MDR XDR side, right? So,
let me ask one question though. What about remediation, right? At any point, is it a premium option to go through, hey, I need you to go and fix it? Is that even an option, or is that not even offered?
So on the event-driven security side, typically it is no remediation, but this is where MDR and XDR come in, right?
Okay.
So I'll kind of cover that. So you know, on the remediation side, it really depends on, you know, if it's the vendor's own agent, if it's integrated to a third-party MDR service. So I'll kind of break it up. So MDRs, taking a endpoint vendor that has EDR capabilities. So let's say, and that's detection and response capabilities. So think of the CrowdStrike, SentinelOne's, you know, even Bitdefenders has the add-on, right? So any of the EDR vendors, right? It's taking those capabilities, or it's a vendor that provides their own agent that sits on top of an endpoint vendor, right? There's vendors out there too as well. I saw some listed in the chat, right? There's vendors that have their own agent, right? That do the EDR and MDR component. But regardless, they need a way to actually take action, right? And so a lot of these EDR vendors give the ability to quarantine a device, or kill a process, or do things on the device to stop it. And on the network side, if the vendors have the APIs available, they might be able to change some firewall rules, right? That's what kind of where XDR comes in. I'll cover that here in a second. But MDR and EDR are really focused kind of terminology on the endpoint, right? On the device, you know, workstations and servers, right? So that's really the EDR and MDR. MDR just means there's a SOC team going through the alerts for you and actually taking action on your behalf, right? So, you know, we had the SIM as a service would go in and they would give you alerts and find stuff from your network, from things that got past your endpoint. Then you have your EDR vendors, which is your endpoint detection and response. If you have MDR, that means that SOC team now manages that endpoint on your behalf, right? Mm-hmm. They can actually take action on your behalf. Does that make sense?
Right. So like EDR is just the software. MDR is somebody's actually monitoring and then doing some sort of action in the event that there's a trigger.
That's right. Yep, 100%. And here's the thing with MDR though, is a lot of times if you're just buying an MDR service and you're not grabbing a logging service, you're only able to see what the EDR is able to see. Does that make sense? So
it's limited view.
Yeah. So the EDR vendors, you know, and as much as they want to market and say they can see everything, they can't, because these vendors, it's too expensive for them to look through all log data on the endpoint. So they look at stuff typically post execution, okay, or when a file gets downloaded, right? Stuff that doesn't live within memory. Now they might market, they say, hey, we look at stuff in memory and we do threat hunting. They may do, but that's not their true focus. Their true focus is you know, post execution type thing, right? So so that's where the MDR, EDR, it's a great tool, but you should have both. You should have really, if you think about it, you should have a logging service, things that get past your security controls, and then you have your MDR service, because let's be honest, MSPs, a lot of them that I've seen, they don't even handle a lot of the endpoint events, right? So I'll look at, you know, talk to some partners and say, show me your SentinelOne portal or your CrowdStrike portal, and there's 400 unresolved or open events, right? So they don't even have, you know, the ability, or they don't have the time to go through and take action on what the endpoint's seeing. So that's why MDR is really critical, is, hey, outsource that work too. So outsource your MDR, your EDR and MDR. So outsource that, right? Either with the vendor themselves or a third party. So it could be SentinelOne has their own service called Vigilance. Bitdefender has their own service. There's CrowdStrike has their own service. There's a lot of vendors that have their own services, right? You can either go with the vendor themselves, or you can go with a third party who does it for them, right?
What about the guys that start over here, the SOC as a service, and they're like, oh, no. We give you all the software. It has to come from us as part of our package. You can't do this pick your own best of breed vendor thing. It's just all or nothing.
Yeah, so that's like a third-party MDR service, right? You know, Blackpoint and others. I saw that in the thread, that comes to mind, right? And they'll pull in data from the endpoint vendor you have, but it's essentially them going through and taking action, typically with their own agent, right? So their own agent has the ability to quarantine devices, kill processes, all that stuff, right? So that's typical.
Or maybe they've already there. I know there's a couple out there that have built their whole SOC service on top of a Sentinel-1, right? Like that they chose that software and they built out from there, or they chose
Silence, or or CrowdStrike, not typically, but Silence or Sentinel-1. Yeah, so that's right. They either use the APIs from the vendors or they use their own technology, right? So, and then let's talk about XDR. Okay, XDR is taking everything. It's called extended detection and response. Everything that we just talked about on the endpoint for the EDR vendors, and pulling in data from the network or other areas where I can maybe take action on firewalls, right? Or I might be able to take action on, blacklisting an IP or changing firewall rules in a part of that service. Does that make sense? But it doesn't necessarily mean the XDR is grabbing all logs either. Does that make so? Really,
so XDR is edge and networking. EDR/MDR is workstation servers, endpoints.
Well, XDR is endpoint and it's all of it.
Okay.
Yeah. So I would say EDR is software only on the endpoint. MDR is managed service on top of that software, and then XDR is pulling in network and management on the software and endpoint. So
there's vendors that just do the network stuff too.
Network only type stuff is typically on the SIMs.
Some people do like a little appliance, they plug it into their switch.
That's on the SIM side. So that's on the logging side. So they're trying to gather all network logs, right?
Okay. Yeah. So what about the over-the-top services, right? Obviously, the Microsoft suite or Google or the CRM or like all these SaaS over-the-top solutions. Like that's not really at the endpoint and that's not really on the network, right? It's kind of both.
It's SaaS, right? So that's a whole other service that's coming out, right? Is taking in the SaaS data and having a managed services on top of that as well. So that's, you'll see that in, and I think, where the market is getting better is when some vendors term themselves as SOC as a service, a lot of them now are doing all of it. They're saying, I can do, your SIM, I can do your log management, I can do your MDR and XDR. Oh, and I can also do your SaaS, right? Monitoring. Now, on the SaaS side, it's typically just monitoring because you're really subject to, like, from a response perspective, the vendor's APIs, and every single SaaS vendor has different levels of APIs, right? And you can't necessarily do some remediation with some SaaS vendors, right? So that's a whole nother, you got to deep dive on that. But anyway, so on the SaaS front, typically what's happening there is they're looking for indicators of compromise around identity theft, right? So, or maybe brute force attacks on that identity, but essentially, what's happening with the identity? Is there a weird suspicious login coming from a foreign country that, impossible login, like the user we know lives in, California, but all of a sudden he signed in and then an hour later he signs in Russia? That's impossible. So a lot of those companies will have their own kind of logging mechanism to get that data, right? To say, hey, we create our own rules to say this is not using Microsoft's native data, for example, but using their own, and saying, hey, this is suspicious, and they'll alert you on that. Or they'll look at risky file shares and stuff like that, right? Like where a file share might be sitting out there or abandoned, or maybe it's a weird behavior. So I would say it's more on the user behavior monitoring side, right?
So, I mean, obviously the big thing when it comes to this is there is an overlap though, right? Like everybody who's using Azure Active Directory instead of the server on the closet, or somebody who's using an Okta, or somebody who's, using a Duo, or like some sort of centralized, identity, kind of, logging, log in, log out, kind of service, right? That kind of falls somewhere in the mix, somewhere across the spectrum now.
Well, yeah. So like so a lot of the vendors who do like SaaS monitoring, for example, will also like pull in logs from Azure AD or Okta or OneLogin or all that. So yeah, they'll pull in as much as they can on the identity side. So yeah, identity fits in this big time, right? Because you got your endpoints and your networks. Well, what about your user, right? There's pieces there as well. So the market's getting a lot more mature in this space, right? You know, I'm yet to see a vendor who does it all really well, right? There's typically right now it's very fragmented, right? So it's like, hey, if I really want a true managed security service, I might need 2 or 3 vendors, right? So I
Well,
might need a
there's one area that we didn't even touch though yet, like, and maybe it's just been done and it's out there, but to be honest with you, MSPs don't really do it well. Mobile device management.
Yeah, so I think this is where Microsoft actually does a really good job here with Intune, right? But the Mac side is lacking. There's third-party vendors there as well. But yeah, so like mobile device management, if you look at like Intune and you look at conditional access policies, that's where I can tie in mobile behavior, laptop behavior, end user identity all in one. So we're starting to see at PAX8 that Microsoft is they're the identity owners, and they're starting to really leverage the device slash identity to make better decisions through conditional access policies, right? So they look at device risk and user risk and make decisions on that, or zero trust, which means you get access to nothing unless we can prove who you say you are and your device is in a healthy state, right?
Okay. But I'm gonna. So we started this whole conversation off with the marketing's very vague, and sometimes somebody who's saying one thing can't even do what that is. Zero trust seems to be like in every sentence in everybody's website. The first thing that you see, I understand it's a methodology, right? But like, is anybody actually doing zero trust?
Well, yeah, so that's another term, like you mentioned, it's another term that's being misused a little bit, but essentially zero trust just means that we're going to lock everything down and trust no one unless you prove certain things to us to make sure that you're legitimate, right? And that could be everything from, you know, think of it like similar to like whitelisting, right? Where it's like I'll only let you in if I know that you can pass these checks, right? Everyone looks bad. Like I don't care. I'm gonna say every one of you are a threat actor until you can prove you're not a threat actor, right? And so Microsoft does a great job at this. That's their conditional access policies. So I say, okay, how did they sign in? Was the behavior normal based on how we think that user signs in? Were they in the right location that we know about them? Is their device in a healthy state, which means there's no viruses that Defender sees on that device, right? Or is the device under compliance? Is endpoint encryption turned on? Like you create rules to say, this is my compliant state. So, once they pass those checks from the device and the end user behavior, you say, you're good to go. We're going to let you in now, right? And so that's kind of where zero trust comes in is just not trusting anyone until you go through certain proof points, right? Other vendors call zero trust other things. I don't want to, bash any vendors marketing, but that's the main zero trust definition. But there's other vendors that get into the zero trust, saying that we're going to lock down applications, which, is also kind of it's a zero trust thing as well, right? It's like, I'm not going to let you access the application unless, we know you're the right person, right? So, so it comes down to, application control, access controls, all that sort of stuff, right?
So big spectrum here, right? How many vendors does an it's like, how many people you need to unscrew a light bulb, put a new one in? How many vendors does an MSP need to truthfully be handling security correctly, or at least well enough, based on June 24th, 2021? Is it 10 vendors? Is it 2 vendors? Like, it seems like there's a potpourri here needed because not anybody's doing everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very subjective question. So it depends on how deep and if you want to go really deep and say, I want to lock down my fortress as as good as I can. In this day and age, it's going to require a significant amount of vendors. I mean, you're talking about quite a bit of vendors. Now, I would say Microsoft is taking on a lot of that now. So I would say like Microsoft can take out probably half of your stack already and do a good job at it. But they don't do everything either, right? So I would say on the Microsoft strong front, they do identity really well, device management really well, and they're definitely getting into other areas that do really well too. Like their endpoint protection is getting crazy good too, and so you're starting to see Microsoft really come in pretty strong here. But there's other layers that you need to add on, right? SOC as a service, which should encompass log management, right? Along and log management as a service, so SIM as a service, that should be a part of most MSP stack, I would hope. You want eyes on what gets past your security controls, right? So SOC as a service, which is SIM as a service, and then you have your MDR or XDR, right? If you wanted to do the best, you say, okay, I want SIM as a service, XDR, and then rely on Microsoft for identity and all that sort of stuff. And then if you want to get even crazier with it, layer on application controls. And but Microsoft has that too. They have App Blocker and they have all kinds of other stuff. So
we didn't even talk about things like email security and backup.
Oh yeah, sorry. So that there's
right, like
there's email security, there's security training and awareness, there's web DNS or proc. That's a whole other crazy category that's getting a lot more mature. Back in a couple of years ago is just the DNS player, which was Cisco that owned the market, right? And but DNS is just one layer of web security, right? That's looking at web security at the address level, right? So I'm looking at it saying, is this address good or bad? Well, web security can be a lot more, you can get a lot more granular because there's legit websites that have very bad things embedded within the website, right? So that's where, Zscaler is the owner in this world of the enterprise, but that's where a proxy-based solution comes in, right? Where I'm going to look at all the traffic within, do SSL inspection and look at all the traffic within this website and see things within the website and remove the malicious content, even in a legit website, right? And so you have those vendors that do proxy or proxy with a hybrid DNS layer and proxy. You have web isolation companies now that are actually showing you everything through a visual layer, so nothing can attach to your device at all. So you have web isolation that gets in the mix, and then the next layer that I would say is kind of all encompassing on this topic is the new term that Gartner came up with is SASE. Are you familiar with SASE?
Tell me what's SASE.
Secure Access Security Edge or Service Edge. I got to look up the exact definition, but what it stands for is I'm going to take my network. And this is really important in remote working. My network is no longer in the office, right? I have people floating all over the place. I have some in the office. I have some at home. Well, because the network is really gone hybrid between home and office, it makes more sense to have your network in the cloud, right? Mm-hmm. And so what happens is you'll have a service where you put your network in the cloud and you'll have all of those remote workers and office workers. You'll have your office connect to that environment and your remote workers connect to that environment in the cloud, right? And then you'll have all your DNS layer lives there, your network firewall rules live there, your a lot of them, some of them even do logging where they'll log all traffic within there, like they'll throw a SIM on this environment. And they'll also do like things like SD-WAN where they'll layer in networking and performance, right, to this environment. And so that's really kind of the all-encompassing new network security layer, right, is a SASE service. We've been looking at that. It's really immature market because Gartner came up with this term a year and a half ago now, and every vendor's chomping at the bit to build something here. So all the big network vendors like Fortinets and Palos and all the big enterprise vendors, they're building SASE. Then you have the SD-WAN vendors that are building SASE. Then you have the VPN vendors building SASE. So you have all these vendors that say, hey, I actually do a part of that already. I should build a full service here. So they have all these vendors coming from different angles and building a SASE service. So it's an immature market right now, but it's going to be a very fast growing market. I would say that in the MSP space, I'd say in next year, 2 years, almost every partner will know what SASE means. I guarantee you.
Wow. This is up and coming, guys. If you're watching this, even after the fact, like, here's what's coming down the line. This isn't even a conference where you have to go into a breakout session. All right. So I feel like is the norm right now, right? Like over 50% of the workers, at least in the US, are working still remotely. They're not in the office. A lot of these companies are either their servers are in a data center or they've adopted a AWS or an Azure, some sort of virtual desktop, virtual server. How do things change now? Where does the MSP start to say, fast forward 24 months, hey, we don't care what your computer is, right? It could be a $500 cheapo laptop. You're just going to log into this session and all of the back end work is now online. And if you ran over your computer tomorrow, there's no data there, right? You're just going to take a new one out of the box, put the, log into the portal, sign in, do your hopefully SSO, MFA, something like that. Completely different set of vendors, by the way. Yeah. Maybe, and then I'm in, right? Is that what the expectation should be now?
Well, I mean, I'd say it depends on the customer environment, because if the customer still has on-premise applications, that kind of creates complexity. Yeah. So if you have like an on-premise application still, you're going to have to go with if you want that kind of experience, you'd have to go with a like Windows Virtual Desktop or something like that, right? Where you bring in your Windows Virtual Desktop or VDI, right? You bring in your application and you also bring in all your cloud services in one container that you can access from any device. But if you're all SaaS, like PAX8, we're all 100% SaaS, right? We're Microsoft, pretty much Microsoft and some security layers, but that's what we use as a company internally. And we go right to the SaaS applications. And our main thing that we focus on is identity management, right? So, and zero trust. So identity management, device trust, identity trust, am I the right person to get into this application based on my behavior? Once I'm in, I access that app, which for us, it's all SaaS. I think that's going to be the future. I think we were born in the cloud as a company. So
right. So no virtual desktop, whatever machine you're on, and that's what you're using to log in. There could be an app, interface, maybe web browser, most likely, but
it's also a web browser.
Yeah. At the end of the day, there's really not that much from a software standpoint, even in play on the computer or mobile. Right.
Yeah, and if you're in that kind of environment, like I mentioned, web isolation, that's a really strong layer to throw on that, right? You have a web isolation technology, DNS, everything's becomes security at the endpoint and at the user identity layer, right? So that's kind of the way it is you focus on tools that are at the endpoint layer. And yeah.
Okay. So when I put all of that together, right? Let's just go really quick, right? SOC SIEM, EDR, MDR, or XDR, depending on how deep you want to go. You have your SaaS applications, you have your identity management, you have your maybe some sort of authentication component in there, right? Some sort of SSO or
definitely 100% SSO. Like SSO everyone should be driving to SSO and MFA, right? I mean, MFA and SSO are a match made in heaven, because if you have one single identity with SSO, MFA becomes a lot less intrusive on your life. Like, for example, with PAX8, we're all SSO. There's not a single app that's not SSO'd, right? So for me, I can't remember the last time I put a password in, because you know what? I use Windows Hello, which is my authentication mechanism as my 2FA thing. So when I log into my computer, it signs me in, it knows me, right? It uses me, it uses that to pass my password. So I don't have to deal with passwords. My face is my 2FA, right? And all I'm doing is I'm accessing my SSO applications, right?
Okay.
So,
So
you
that,
know,
so that everybody who, and I would say 8 out of 10 MSPs haven't even really even internally adopted SSO, let alone roll it out to their customers, right? So it's still a little bit of virgin territory from a math standpoint. So you have that. Then you still have your email security, your web security, your DNS filtering security, your content management. You said web isolation, right? That's in there. And then we haven't even talked about this new category, or we have SASE, right? Let's just put that off to the left for a second because we're not there 100% yet. When I take all of those pieces together, you're, if you're billing per user, I think a lot of people are, and the majority of them are, you're probably north of $200 a user now.
I mean, I would say the stack of that security stack would probably cost an MSP $50 a user, just cost probably that stack somewhere in there. So
a lot less than I thought, to be honest.
well, their cost, right? So they'll obviously mark that up, and so that would probably tack on $100 to whatever the other stuff you're doing, right? So yeah, you're right. You're probably around the $200 mark per user.
And then how much more labor is involved to actually maintain all of this, right? Like you said, what good is it if you log into the portal and 400 events haven't been touched, right? Like how much of that does the third party outside SOC vendor do for you versus what you're doing internally?
I mean, I would say I would hope MSPs really start focusing on outsourcing that stuff because and that cost point would include, managed services on that, right? So that would be outsourcing all that work, right? So you're talking about, if you look at the SIM as a service type tools, depending on your log. Now, I will say there's a caveat. If you have long-term log storage, like if I'm holding data for, a year or less, I'm okay. But if I have a customer that says I need to keep data for 3 years or all my logs, the price goes up big time, right? So I'd say that's one caveat. But on the log management side, you're probably talking between, at the low end, I don't know, like $6 a device, something like that, to upwards of, I don't know, $15-20 a device or more, right? And then that's the log side. And the MDR or XDR, that's probably another $10 or so, like low end 6, high end 15, somewhere in there, depending on the vendor. And then you have your email securities, which is like it's cheap, right? A couple bucks. Your DNS or web security layer is a couple bucks. So, you add them up, and then you have your Microsoft. But the good thing about Microsoft is every MSP that watches this, please get to Microsoft Business Premium. That should be your main SKU, because that literally includes like a good chunk of your identity management stack, your device compliance stack. Like it's $20 a user MSRP for Business Premium. I would hope that most MSPs go to that stack because it does cut a lot of cost and has a big big piece of security footprint.
Okay, so instead of the $12.50 guy, bumping up to the $20 guy.
Yeah, it's just a huge, immense value. You get Intune, you get all your, you get all your Azure Active Directory premium stuff. So your premium identity, your SSOs, your MFAs, your that includes advanced email security, archiving, encryption, all that stuff. So it's a pretty advanced stack that comes with it.
Got it. That's important to know. And then like some of the more, I know there's some people who have created entire practices around this, right? Especially in like certain like regulated kind of verticals, right? Law enforcement and all this other stuff. Like I think once you go up to like an E3 in Microsoft, there's like a whole different suite that opens up in terms of their security stuff, right?
It does. That gets really expensive though. Like, I mean, you're talking about on the enterprise side, their high end stack is $50 per user or something like that, or maybe it's 36. I can't remember. Their M365 E5. That one pretty much has everything. But yeah, so the enterprise has a few more security features, but for the most part, as long as your customer's under 250 users, Business Premium has like 80% of what the enterprise full stack has. I mean, they really throw in a ton of value to that small business package. They are doing some stuff now. Microsoft is about to release some new security packages around their endpoint protection packages. So they're really kind of showcasing their endpoint suite for Defender ATP, which I think they just changed the name. Can't keep up. I think it's Defender for Endpoint, Defender for Email, Defender for Identity. So all that sort of stuff.
That would be in addition to a Business Premium.
Some pieces come with Business Premium. So like Defender for Identity, and Identity has Azure AD Premium 1 and 2. There's multiple levels of it, but you know, Business Premium I think comes with, used to be called Premium P1, which has SSO, MFA, password self-service resets. It has I think risky logins, risky sign-ins, all that sort of stuff. So it has a good chunk in there. Not everything, but it does have a good chunk of security in there on the identity side.
So how much, like, obviously could go with a third-party email encryption service, but or go with the built-in. Like, it seems like Microsoft.
You could go all Microsoft. You could literally, if you wanted to, if you're an MSP that wants to go all, I know MSPs, a couple good ones that you know personally, that are almost all 100% Microsoft. And you know, what they'll do is they'll do the Microsoft 365 E5, which is I think 30, or it's either 36 or 50. I can't remember off the top of my head, but the highest end package of Microsoft. They deploy that, and then they throw in Microsoft Azure Sentinel, which is Azure's SIM, right? So they throw in Microsoft SIM in there, and they have the E5, and then they layer on a couple extra, like maybe like 1 or 2 extra vendors, and that's it. Like they're literally like max a 3-vendor stack, and almost 90% of it's Microsoft. So
That's a whole different story, man. That makes it sound a lot more manageable at 3 vendors than 15.
Yeah, it is. But Microsoft's management is also, if you're a pretty sophisticated MSP and you figured out, you know, you have all your PowerShell scripts, you have some good SaaS management involved, how you're managing it, then it's actually really manageable. But for smaller partners today, it's a little bit cumbersome, but Microsoft is working on a lot of really cool things on that front. So, you know, it will get better over time for sure. And Microsoft is putting a lot of focus on making management easier and more secure for partners.
I was on a call today, and the guy that does, like, the 365 admin for this MSP, pretty nice size MSP, he had every PowerShell module loaded in. And just to open up the PowerShell, you know, ISE panel took him 2 minutes for all of that to load. And I was like, why is it taking so long? He's like, I have all 150 plus modules. I was like, okay. And sat there and me. So there are, it's beefy.
I mean, it's a real thing. Partners that really dive in deep with Microsoft are some of our most advanced, mature partners, and they absolutely love it if they do it right. But it's pretty tough learning curve to get there, right? But it can be done, and some of our biggest, most mature partners do it, and they have a really profitable business as well, by the way.
100%. So if you were to say, let's take that guy off the table, because that's the minority, not the majority, right? But let's just say I want to be a security focused MSP. I know there's always the, well, how can you call yourself an MSSP? No. Let's just say a security focused MSP, taking all the information we put here, that $50 cost point on top of whatever they charge, right? And I just say it's gonna, your price point's gonna be around $200 per user. I think once you package it all together, that would get you in a pretty good place. It may not be Fort Knox, but it's not the guy that, you know, literally is just turning on the bare minimum either.
Well, if you do the right stack, even if like it won't stop everything. You should know when something does happen, or there's like good chance that, if a breach happened, and by the way, like everyone should just assume breach. Like at some point, every one of your customers will be breached, or they're already breached, you just don't know it. So, I'd say that, like, just think like that. As an MSP, you should think every one of my customers is breached or it will be breached. So what tools do I put in place to try to reduce my risk? And to do that, you need all these kind of tools. I would say the most important is get a good MSSP or vendor to help you on the log management side, the SIM as a service, to get eyes on everything that's going on in your network and on your devices. That's a good way to start, because they'll be able to see if anything's going on, if anything got past the security controls. Even if you had bad security controls, there's at least eyes on glass. But that's not, they won't find everything either, right? So there's no silver bullet in security. It's just, how do I reduce my risk as much as possible? And having just endpoint, like the security 2-3 years ago in the MSP space, is just having email security and endpoint security and network, and that definitely does not cut it anymore. There's just no way. Not with automation, with the hackers going after SMB in automated fashion without having ransomware as a service and all kinds of stuff out there, where they don't even need to be experts in being hacker to do some damage in the SMB. So because of that, there's such a high risk. So yeah, so it definitely is the time to increase your security stack.
I mean, this has definitely been a crash course for anyone that didn't understand the verbiage and just tried to figure out what vendor does what. What's the best messaging to the end customer? I mean, listen, the news has done a pretty good billboard, thing for everyone, right? I mean, if nobody can buy gas, or gas is $7 a gallon because a whole pipeline shut down, I think they got the message, hopefully. But like, when you're going to your customer and you're like, hey, I'm gonna need to bump, even a smaller customer, hey, I'm gonna need another $1,000 a month, $1,500 a month to add these other services. How do you present that English to them where they're like, what's the value here? Why am I paying this extra money?
I mean, it comes down to, like, it's their data, right? So what's the most important resource? It's worth more than oil and gold, is data, right? Data is the most precious resource in any organization. So, the question just doesn't come down to, like, why should I buy this? It's, how important is your data? How important is your business? Like, if you really value your business and you don't want to lose a bunch of money, and have a whole, like, even if you get ransomware or get attacked and you have a breach, it's not just losing money for downtime or whatever. It's also loss of reputation. I mean, I hate to say it, but look at SolarWinds and look at all these companies. You know how long it's going to take them to recover their brand, if ever, right? So, I know other MSPs who got breached and every one of their customers got ransomware. That MSP is never getting back into the industry they serve. It's never going to happen. So, the risk, and it's not just to your customer, it's the risk to our partners, right? Because they're an extension. So it hurts their reputation as well. So I'd say is, how valuable do you value your data, and how valuable do you value your reputation? And so, if you want to protect that, you should spend money on it, because the risks are just too high, because it's no longer an if, it's a when. And we, as an MSP, if I were an MSP, I'd say it's my job to reduce your risk, to protect your brand, to protect your company. And if you don't value your company and your brand, I'm probably the wrong MSP for you, right?
I mean, that's a clear message. That's a very non-technical message too. It's a business conversation.
Yep. So, I mean, like I said, it comes down to I wouldn't get into the weeds of how I'm going to stop you. I mean, if you want to get into like non-technical security weeds, like, I would say if you do one thing right now, it's also MFA, like MFA everything. Because like that alone will cut down on a good chunk of risk, right? So, and that's a pretty non-technical message as well. It's just, we need, and in our market, MFA is super low adopted, and we see some stats on it. So I would say, if you're just a partner that says, I don't know where to get started, start with the identity and protect your users and make sure that they have MFA turned on every app they access. And if they don't like it, well, it is what it is. It's no longer, I don't care. It's okay. Well, if you don't turn this on, you have a very good chance of hurting your company.
100%.
So,
Ryan, I mean, this was absolutely not a commercial for PAX8. I think this was actually a pretty good overview for anybody, any vendor. But I know PAX8 does a bunch of stuff to help educate, right, on this stuff, right? I think you guys do like boot camps and that kind of stuff. Where can they find information on where to learn more?
yeah, so I think, from our perspective, we try to, I mean, we're never going to be completely agnostic because we represent certain vendors, right? But we are probably one of the most agnostic people in the channel because we do have options, right? So we're not going to come at it and say, buy this product and represent something that it's not because it's our product. It's, what are you trying to do? And our security specialists, we have at this point, I think every one of our security specialists at PAX8 are certified with CompTIA Security Plus. We're spending a lot of time on education, getting you up to speed on CIS controls. By the way, mapping it to controls is really easy to explain to security to your customer. Is if they ask you what you're doing, well, mapping this to industry standards, right? Because our security specialists can help. Just to have the conversation of, here's the things that you could do, here's the vendors that fit in, and here's what we're hearing our partners say about these different vendors. We have that kind of agnostic approach, right? Because we're really not trying to say this is the right vendor. It's tell me and we'll help you solve your problem. So I'd say if you're a PAX8 partner, get in touch with your security specialist and spend some time building out a stack and going through a stack review and going through a CIS control review where they can send you out a spreadsheet to see what kind of controls you have in place, to see what kind of gaps you have.
That's a good, that's not something you're charging for. That's just part of the calling up.
Yes, that's free. Just go through your security specialist. That's the best way to do it. And we also have boot camps and education for sure, but I think the reps are a fast way to go about it and do it pretty quickly. And we're spending a lot of time on education, like real one-on-one coaching and one-to-many through C-level acquisition. So there's gonna be a lot of stuff we're beefing up there as well. So that's like when you really want to get serious, right?
That's awesome. Ryan, I mean, Ryan, I think you spelled out a lot for a lot of people. I think it's important that everybody pay attention to the marketing and ask the questions. It sounds like a few questions really start to clear up the road, right? But if you don't know what to ask, you just got to drink whatever the Kool-Aid is. Not that everybody's drinking that Kool-Aid, but you got to know what you're buying, right? You do the same thing in your own personal lives, right? You buy a phone, you buy a car, like, does it have this package? Does it have that package? You almost need to have a little bit of a checklist to make sure that you know what you're buying. But I honestly, a lot of takeaways from here, but the $50 per user price point's it's way more manageable than I think a lot of people think, to be honest.
Price came down a lot over the last few years, so it's definitely manageable. It's doable, manageable. I think it just comes down to, can you have the right conversation with your customers to sell the value of that service, right? Because they should have good security controls. It comes down to can you pitch that to your customer. By the way, our security team, they can also help you with a pitch deck. We have white labeled resources of presentations you can use, what scripts you should use. So all that sort of stuff we can cover as well. So
that's fantastic, guys. PAX8.com. If you're not a partner, check it out. By the way, it doesn't cost you anything to sign up to be a partner, right? So like, you can sign up as a partner, fill out the form, talk to somebody, and if you like what you hear, then you buy. I don't know how I don't know if it could be any better than that, right? They're not charging you for the time, which is great. Guys, this whole session was recorded. MSPinitiative.com under sessions. Go back. There's a couple other sessions we've had with Ryan and crew. They're all on that page. Good information to have, and at least gives you some good starting points to start to look for more information. Ryan, I really appreciate your time. I know you're busy. Can't wait to have you back. This was great content.
Awesome. Thanks.
All right.
Thanks, George. See you later, man.